Hey everybody, just waiting for more people to filter in. Get started in a few minutes. Welcome everybody, just waiting on some more people to filter in and then we'll get started. All right, just going to give it a couple more minutes here and then we'll get started. All right. Thank you to everybody who decided to join us today. My name is Randy Goldberg. I am the co-founder and chief brand officer of Bombas. For those of you who aren't 100% sure, Bombas is a comfort-focused apparel brand with a mission to help those in need. So understanding homelessness and helping the homeless community is core to who we are as a company. We do that through our product donations. So for every pair of Bombas socks or for every Bombas t-shirt you buy, we donate a product to one of our giving partners. But we also do that through supporting those giving partners, advocating on their behalf, learning from members of the homeless community, and using our microphone to help amplify and spread information and affect change on behalf of the homeless community. And that's why we're here tonight. Lately, I've been seeing this a lot, but it feels like homelessness has been more in the national conversation. And as we were talking as a company about the topic and talking with some of our homeless friends, we thought it would be a good time just to host a few very smart individuals who have a lot to say on the topic to help all of us, work through how to be a better advocate for the homeless community, how to talk about this issue with our friends and families, and what has been going on lately, with COVID and with a lot of the struggles of this year. A lot of people have lost their job, have lost their home. And, in times of crisis, it's often those who have the least who need the most help. So with all of that as a backdrop and heading into the holiday season, we wanted to gather this group together. This is a group of really important advocates, people who we learn a lot from as a company and people who we are very happy to support with our work. And I'm going to pass things over right now to Kelly Cobb, who's our Vice President of Giving, to introduce the group and to lead this discussion.
Thanks, Randy. And a warm hello to everyone who's joined us tonight. We're so glad that you're here. Like Randy said, we talk a lot about the topic of homelessness at Bombas. The conversations and experiences we have inform so many of the decisions that we make on a daily basis. And we're so glad for the first time to invite you, our greater community, to be part of this conversation. Thank you first for all the thoughtful questions that so many of you sent through. I think we may need a few more conversations to cover them all, but we are going to get to a lot of important topics tonight. I think that one of the reasons it can feel hard to talk about homelessness is because there's a lot that we may not know. There are a lot of misconceptions and long held ideas that aren't representative of the realities of homelessness. We're just not sure where to begin a lot of the time. And that's why we're here. Knowledge is really empowering, and I'm lucky to be joined by some very knowledgeable people that represent a wide range of perspectives. So I'm very pleased to introduce first Shams DaBaron, who is a filmmaker, writer, and hip hop pioneer. Shams is using his experience with homelessness to advocate for improved services, better policies, and centering the voices of directly impacted individuals. Josh Dean, who is the executive director of Human.NYC and a longtime friend of Bombas. Josh has spent years working very closely with individuals experiencing street homelessness, helping their voices to be heard, and working to impact policy in New York City. And also Corinne Low, who is a professor of business economics and public policy at Wharton and the co-founder of Upper West Side Open Hearts initiative, which has helped to create a model of ways that a community can work with people experiencing homelessness, both in shelters and on the street, and welcome them with love and assist with needed services. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here. Let's start by talking about street homelessness. It's something that many of us are aware of and encounter on a daily basis, particularly if we're living in cities. Let's talk about what it means, why are folks on the street versus the shelter, and what that path looks like to get off the street and find housing. Josh, this is obviously something that you've been studying for a number of years and have made significant progress on. Will you walk us through this challenging journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Kelly and Randy, for organizing this, and the team at Bombas. The socks that we've been giving out have been more appreciated now than ever during these difficult times. So really appreciate you all. With regards to street homelessness, this is the population of homeless people that we're more likely to see on our everyday walks around the city or wherever you are in the country. If you see someone who's homeless and is outside, chances are they're what we call unsheltered or street homeless. That means that they have either have an option to stay in a shelter and have chosen not to take that option, or they don't have that option. Here in New York, where we work, there's a right to shelter. So anyone who wants a shelter can take one. But when we talk to people on the streets about why they've chosen to stay on the streets instead of the shelters, the thing we hear more than anything else is people telling us, I feel safer on the streets than in the shelters. And when we take the time to listen and hear the reasons why people make that decision, I can only describe that as a rational choice. One that if I found myself being homeless, I may end up making as well. So once somebody says, okay, I'm going to, I'm homeless and I'm going to try to secure housing while living on the streets, they face a pretty arduous and bureaucratic process to get housing. It takes a very long time. And one of the challenges is you have to stay in touch with your case manager throughout that entire time. The case manager is the person who's going to walk you through all of the steps, who's going to work through all your applications, get you all your paperwork, your identification, your benefits. But imagine trying to stay in touch with someone without having a home. Maybe you have a phone and that phone gets stolen, or you lose your phone, or you drop your phone. Maybe the police are moving you around from location to location, and now your case manager can't find you anymore. Maybe your case manager doesn't have housing for you because there's not enough housing and has to keep telling you, I'm sorry, we have to wait, we have to wait, we have to wait. And imagine how frustrating that would be. So what ultimately it comes down to at the end of the day, though, is this gap between supply and demand. There are so many more people who need housing on the streets than there are housing units available for people who are homeless. And that creates a really long wait. That's especially the case for people who are homeless and also working through substance use disorders or any sort of mental illness. Those people will typically end up in a type of housing called supportive housing, where there's supportive services on site. But right now in New York City, there are, for every vacancy in supportive housing, there are 5 approved supportive housing applications. So there's a really, really long wait. And a lot more housing is needed to actually move people from the streets into housing. But in the meantime, there's so much we can be doing to support our neighbors on the streets and make sure that they're that they're at the very least healthy and safe during the difficult time.
Thanks, Josh. I think another point that's important to remember too is, we are here in New York City, but homelessness can look so different from place to place. And I think that especially for folks perhaps living in the suburbs or in places where you think that you might not be seeing it or that homelessness isn't a problem, considering that even situations where folks are sleeping doubled up or staying on the couch of a relative or sleeping in one's car, there's a lot of situations that can be happening that you're just not aware of. It could be someone that you work with, someone that you know well. So I think having this understanding that homelessness can look very different from person to person and across a variety of situations. But I think we'll get the chance to dig a little bit deeper into understanding what creates these situations. So Corinne, the last time that we spoke, we got into a great conversation about, above all, the importance of community and a support network. Will you talk to us about why homelessness is so much more than not having a place to live?
Yeah, so, Josh mentioned people struggling with substance use or people struggling with mental illness. And I think if all of us just reflected on our family and friend networks right now, we would all be able to think of people who struggled with substance use or mental illness. But the difference between somebody who might grow up with certain kinds of privilege, who might be a white kid from the suburbs, let's say, and have those struggles, is that they might have a support network to fall back on. So a lot of the people who experience homelessness kind of experience some of the same things that we all experience in our life. Maybe it's a breakup, where you were living together and now you have to move out. And if you have a support network, you go stay at your parents' house, right? Or, maybe it's that you are struggling with substance use. And if you're, a white college kid, your parents put you up in the best rehab in town, right? And do that repeatedly, maybe even though you might try and fail to remain sober. So I think that's what it's such an important distinction to make, that it's not really about whatever brought that person there. A lot of times people try to say, oh, but the issue is that they're a drug addict, right? But that's not the issue, because the issue is really the lack of a social safety net. Because if you experience something like drug addiction or mental illness and you have access to the proper support network and social services, there's no reason that you would then experience homelessness. And so I think if we, look inside our own family networks and friends networks and think about all those times when people might have stumbled and not then experienced homelessness, that can be very revealing about the role that privilege plays and the lack of social safety net and family support plays in homelessness.
I think that's a hugely important point, and also relates to folks either having a job, losing a job, not having a job. And there tends to be this belief that many hold that for people who are homeless, they just need to get a job. And I want to talk about what's problematic with that notion. Shams, we recently spoke about an experience that you had with being forced to prioritize getting a job before you could be eligible for the services that you believed you would need to be able to successfully maintain this employment. Could you talk about the importance of prioritizing services based on an individual's needs and the impact of bringing those services on site? Shams, you're on mute.
Yes, basically, the way the system is set up, we call it the system. But the way the system is set up is more like a big hustle that they have that basically perpetuates the same issues. It doesn't really solve any of the problems. So when a person goes into the shelter system, they figure they have these things when you deal with HRA, you go through a process where you go to a job development place and they try to shift you into jobs that are like, MTA, the Parks Department, et cetera, et cetera. If you go in and you say, look, well, I'm really struggling with substance use disorder. I have a problem, I'm drinking too much or I'm using the drugs or whatever, and I want help for it. If you go in, you say, something, I'm suicidal right now, I'm ready to kill myself, or I'm just dealing with depression. A lot of times that's put to the side. You still be shuffled into this setup of, well, look, we're going to put you in this job program. We're going to get you ready so that you can work for your benefits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My personal experience was similar to that. I asked for help for mental illness. I asked for help for substance use disorder. And instead of them putting me in places that could deal with those issues, they basically said, well, you got to go to We Care. We got to see if you really got an issue. And if you don't, then we're going to send you straight to what they call it, back to work. That was their program, back to work. So when I went in and I'm telling them all these things about me, like, look, you know, I'm drinking, I'm this and that, and you know, I'm really feeling depressed. That was ignored. The only thing that mattered, they say, well, look, he looks like he's able to work. He looks like an able-bodied male. Let him work. And I'm looking like, wait a minute, they're not even putting the issues. And as I'm walking out and I'm seeing somebody, looks like he barely could walk. He looks like, you know, he came in with some liquor bottles and stuff. This is a person that, you know, they're probably going to, you know, shuffle through the system, just put him in a shelter and say, you know, he can't work. But I walked out saying to myself, well, damn, the next time I go in and I try to get help, and I've been told this, that, well, your alcohol level, because they test you, they blood test you and everything. And they say your alcohol level is not to the point where we feel you need help. So what I did to get help is, before I walked in there, and I wasn't really drinking at the time, I was trying not to drink, but to get the help, I went and bought a whole bunch of beer and I drank it early in the morning, something I never do. I did it then before I had my appointment, to make sure that the alcohol level was at a certain point that it could register so I could get the help. And I went through my mind, I said, well, what I gotta do? Smoke crack, something I don't do, smoke weed, or, you know, get more drugs in my system. This was the craziness that I had to think, just to try and get help, because that's all I wanted. I wanted help. I wanted to change my life. For mental illness, that was a whole nother thing. That's different. So once I got past the alcohol thing, I had to tell them, look, I know that what's going on with me is, I'm not a doctor. I didn't self-diagnose myself. I said, what's going on with me is you know, I know I'm you know, I feel like killing myself. You know, I don't feel like living. You know, I'm depressed. I don't feel good. And the level of conversation you have to go through with their psychosocials to prove that, look, I have a problem, is crazy. You know, no pun intended. I had to really, you know, and I'm not gonna lie, because in my mind, I'm saying I want them to really diagnose me the right way so they could give me the help I need. And I'm not a person that's just looking for pills. I'm looking for help. So, but at some point, they're like, well, look, you said you're contemplating suicide. Like, did you try to jump, or was you just thinking about it? I'm like, well, I thought about it. Well, that's not really, you know, that's not like you really was trying. And I'm like, listen, something's wrong. You know, the only coping mechanism I got is the alcohol. That's, you know, it's a downward spiral, and there's no help for it. You know, and I was fortunate that I understood that Project Renewal, the shelter that I went to and I asked for, they had the ability to deal with all those different issues. So they had an outpatient, they had a medical facility that has psychiatrists, you know. So I specifically asked for those things so I can get the help that I need. And I was fortunate that I got it, but I went through so much just to get to that point. And the negative, and I'll end with this, is the negative is that the shelter component, there's no synergy between that. The shelter component was, as I describe it, as drug debts. There's no help in those components. And my advocacy basically started to try and bring the synergy between those things, because I got the experience of going to the outpatient, going to my psychiatrist, and then when it's time to go and get into my bed, I'm walking to a bed surrounded in an environment that's a drug den. So that doesn't help that creates more challenges. And so that's where my advocacy really begins. So.
Thank you, Shams. And we will come back to talking a little bit more about the advocacy piece and the importance of having in-house services, which I know is extremely important. There is what you're illustrating, though, is such a huge disconnect between individual needs and the services that are available. And on the topic of another disconnect, Josh, going back to the topic of employment, often a job or even two jobs isn't enough to sustain housing. Let's talk about affordable housing, why it's so elusive, how housing vouchers can help in some instances, and what needs to change.
Yeah, so when it comes to affordable housing, the key question to always ask is affordable to who? Truly deeply affordable housing that would benefit homeless New Yorkers or homeless people across the country is very, very hard to come by. So one thing that local municipalities have done, and we've done here in New York, to try to bridge that gap between the affordable housing, which in many cases is not affordable for people who are experiencing homelessness, is to introduce housing vouchers. That'll basically give people a monthly amount that they can use that voucher towards to try to find an apartment. The challenge here in New York and the challenge in many other places is that the housing vouchers are below the fair market value. So people have a really, really hard time finding an apartment within their budget. So in New York now, there are thousands of people who have these vouchers, but are still living in the shelters or still living on the streets, not because they want to, but because they can't actually find a place that will, take their voucher because it's not enough. And in many cases, the landlords also discriminate against people who are holding vouchers and prefer to rent to people who are renting without a voucher. So what we really need to do is increase both the amount of affordable housing that is deeply, deeply affordable for people who are homeless, and also increase the housing voucher amount to fair market rate. So fair market rate is the, what it would cost to rent an apartment in a specific neighborhood.
Josh, would it cost more if we increase the voucher?
Was just getting there. So it would actually save in New York, it would save us so much money if we actually just increase the voucher from what it is now, around $1,200 to $1,600, because that would allow people to get housing. And that would save us so much money, because right now when someone's in shelter, it actually costs the city $3,500 a month for a single adult to be living in a shelter. So that could be someone who's living in a room with a dozen or more people, and that's still costing the city so much money.
Why is that, Josh? I'm just curious why it costs so much and why it's so much more for the housing than the voucher.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is when it starts out, it's like, okay, it's let's get these people in the building, and then you need to hire security, you need to hire janitorial staff, you need to hire caseworkers who may or may not be helping, and based on Shams' experience, sounds like oftentimes they're ill-equipped to actually provide the level of help that someone needs. And before you know it, those costs really just start to add up. And at the end of the day, if we empower people to live independently, either people who don't have a mental illness or substance use disorder and maybe are able to live completely independently, or on the other side, people who may need a higher level of services and supportive housing, and then the whole range in the middle of people who may need some help, but not the extent that some others may need. If we could figure that out, instead of warehousing people in shelters, dozens of people to a room, that actually saves the city a lot of money. So what we're really trying to say to the city now is, not only are we in a human crisis, we're in a financial crisis right now during the pandemic. This is the time to do this. This is the time to raise the vouchers. This is the time to make sure that we're investing in housing for people who are homeless, and hopefully they will hear our calls. But a lot of fighting still to do, and grateful to be in the fight with Shams and Corinne and all the other advocates.
Hey, can I say something on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, let's just understand this. The city is basically or the state is operating in a horrible way when it comes to the homelessness. As Josh pointed out, just think of the dynamic of $1,200 for a voucher that doesn't pay for any apartment in New York City, but $3,500 to be on a bed. Let's just think about that. It's a bed. And I've been in the congregate shelters. I've been in Ward's Island where they got 100 people in a dorm style setting. 100 people on this floor, 100 people on another floor, and then 100 people. So you got 300 people at a rate of 3,500 per person. Now, what I experienced, what I studied is that there are houses out here. There are apartments that are available, you know, and if you gave me a voucher that was market rate, as Josh said, then there's more of a likelihood that I would get into that apartment. And if there was extra services needed, like supportive services, that could be added. That's something that they do with what they call scattered sites. But the voucher program they have, which is City FEPS, is just at 1,200, is just nobody's taking that. So they give it out easy, but there's no landlord that's willing to accept that. And so what they try to do now, this is what's happening now, is they're trying to push people into something called 2010E, which is for people with more so with mental illness. So even if you don't really classify as a person with mental illness, they'll guide you into going through the process so that you could get under that classification, because that's an easier voucher program to secure housing for. It's like a big hustle. And that's something that we gotta get away from, because it's hurting the economy, it's killing taxpayers' money, it's totally unnecessary. Most of the people that are in shelters because of this are staying in the shelters for no less than a year. Around me, maybe 60, 70% of the people have been in this shelter, and we're talking about almost 300 people, for at least 2 to 3 years.
And when you add it up, oftentimes, you know, the city will have spent $200,000 easily on shelter for somebody, right? When you're in shelter for a period of multiple years at $3,500 a month, you know, the city can have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single person, and they're no better off in terms of kind of moving on with their life and getting to a more stable situation. So that's what's outrageous. You know, as an economist, it doesn't make any sense economically, but it also isn't right for people to be stuck in that shelter system for years. It should be a temporary, you know, short-term system that then gets you into housing.
Right. And I think also the frightening thing right now, especially, you know, being in the midst of COVID, is the eviction crisis that we're facing, and the impact that is going to have, has already had on folks, and is going to have in the very near future, especially as eviction moratoriums start to expire. Josh, I'd love to have you weigh in a little bit on the impact that COVID has been having on especially unhoused folks, or folks experiencing street homelessness. There's this sense that homelessness has felt especially apparent. Can you talk to us about what some of the greatest challenges for unhoused folks have been?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a survey back when the temperature was a lot hotter in the summer, and basically asked people what the highest needs that they were seeing on the streets were, people who were living on the streets. And the three things that came back to us and stood out the most were a need for a place to use the bathroom, a need for a place to drink water, and needs for places to shower. I see Shams nodding to that. I think what people had told us a lot about bathrooms and water specifically was, it was clear that rather than relying on public places, they had been relying on private places. So people were using the bathroom at places like Starbucks and McDonald's, and getting cups of water at Starbucks and McDonald's. And once the pandemic hit, not only did a lot of local restaurants close down, but there were more restrictions for who could come in and out of different places. So people were really suffering, and the need to do something that so many of us take for granted, to use the bathroom every day, became a huge challenge. One of the women that I work with, there was a day where she spent over an hour walking around the city trying to find somewhere to use the bathroom. She was even turned away from a hospital. And she was someone who suffers from IBS. And, you know, it was painful just to hear the story. I can't imagine what she went through. So really the situation became a lot more desperate. And in the meantime, you know, people who typically if their source of income was asking strangers to donate money, that's also something that people were more hesitant to do, for fear of contracting or spreading the virus. And that, on top of the really, really brutal physical challenges came a lot of mental and emotional challenges too. Being homeless is already something that people describe as extremely isolating and depressing. And that's something that we've been hearing for years now. But I think during the pandemic, when people were, it's already a challenge when so many people don't make eye contact with you and step around you and try to avoid you. But I think that feeling became more stark than ever before during the pandemic. So some of the greatest challenges are at the end of the day some of the most simple ones, and it's a really, really a shame that we haven't been able to solve a crisis that should be as easy as making sure every person in the city has a place to use the bathroom, or every person in the city has a place to drink water. We have to be able to fix those things.
Thanks, Josh. And I think that's where the importance of advocacy comes in such a big way. And, there are so many folks that are out there innovating for change during this time, which is certainly a positive. Corinne, I know that you saw a great opportunity in your neighborhood to become an advocate. Will you tell us a little bit more about your experiencing founding Upper West Side Open Hearts and the great importance of making positive voices louder?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, just to be on the panel with Josh and Shams with these great advocates, I did not consider myself a homelessness advocate or expert, as early as, this summer. But what happened is that during the COVID pandemic, a lot of cities moved people from congregate shelters where people might be, 50 to a room, and moved them to hotel rooms because the hotels are empty right now. There's not a lot of tourism. And so that was kind of a win-win solution, both to save lives and to, have a way to give the hotels some business. So it makes sense. And it's actually, I think, a really great solution. And we would actually like them to go back and take the rest of the people out of congregate shelters, because they kind of moved about half of the people into hotels and not everybody. But one of the things that happened is that this population that had been living in shelters suddenly became more visible to neighborhoods that have not historically had their fair share of things like homeless shelters. And so I live on the Upper West Side in New York, and this was a neighborhood that did not have a lot of homeless shelters. And now suddenly 3 hotels were turned into homeless shelters. At the same time, there was a rising visibility of street homelessness because, the subways were closed and libraries were closed. And so people were, spending more time on the street, and the streets were empty of other people. And there was a lot of conflation between different issues. And so there was a very vocal and, frankly, some of it was very prejudiced outcry against the shelters being placed in our neighborhood. And I just remember thinking, when I heard some of the arguments, and they were all different kinds, right? It was, crime is going to increase, and it's not safe for our children. But then even, but this is an expensive neighborhood, and wouldn't it be better for the people in shelters if they were placed in a cheaper neighborhood? And when I heard those things, I remember thinking, like, this is it. This is how the people in the 1960s who believed that, they should keep their neighborhoods all white and keep Black people from moving to their suburbs. This is how they talked and convinced themselves that they weren't racists, and it was happening right now in my neighborhood. And so I just, in terms of my values, felt like I needed to get involved in an issue that I had never actually been involved in. And so I got together with the groups of my neighbors who felt similarly, and just, went to the shelter and tried to see what we could do to help. Could we drop off donations, and how could we make people feel welcome? And a friend of mine, Amanda, had the idea of going and, drawing chalk on the sidewalk outside the shelter and just letting people know, you're welcome, you're wanted here, we're glad you're our neighbor, and that was the first thing we did. And so Shams actually saw that chalk, and he tells this story better than I do, but he emailed us and said, oh yeah, the chalk on the floor is nice, but that's not what we need. We need services. And so, Shams got together with some of our members, and we started figuring out, okay, what do you need? And can the community help with that? Because, hey, like, we've got, social workers who could volunteer. We've got physical therapists who could volunteer. We want to help. We're your neighbors. And so we actually brought in, things like AA meetings and life skills workshops and things like that were just run volunteer by the community. And I felt like when we did that, it also pressured the service provider themselves, Project Renewal, to step up. And Shams had been asking them to bring more of their services on site, which traditionally are not on site in a shelter, but traditionally they're outpatient. But now that the shelter had been moved and neighbors were complaining, there was suddenly this focus of like, oh, they don't get enough services, because people who hadn't historically lived next to shelters were suddenly seeing up close and personal that the shelter system didn't really work for people. And so, Project Renewal then brought a lot of services on site to Lucerne. And that's what I think is really beautiful about what we've created now, is that it's now a shelter that, has individual rooms, on-site services, and a lot of community support. And in terms of amplifying those sort of positive voices, what I learned in doing this is that this is something that any like local government will tell you happens, or, nonprofit, when they go and try to cite a shelter, there's tons of people who complain. And in the particular case that we're facing right now over the shelter where Shams stays, called the Lucerne Hotel, there were people who complained, and the mayor actually agreed to move the shelter out and transfer them to another hotel downtown, and there's currently a legal battle over it. And I remember the judge saying in one of the proceedings over this legal battle, saying, if we only placed shelters places where nobody complained, we wouldn't put them anywhere, because there is actually always going to be a group of people who say, no, that's going to make my property values go down, and oh, I'm scared about crime, and people who might be prejudiced. And what the people who typically are supportive, they're not thinking, oh, let me go yell at my elected officials. They're thinking, what can I do to help? But that's not enough, because then the elected officials just hear the voices that are saying, no, I don't want that here, and they react to that. And so what we tried to do was to really enter in with a voice that said, we want them here. We are happy to help. It's a freaking pandemic, and we are more than willing to share our neighborhood if it means people don't die of COVID. Like, that is no question. If my property values go down, my property values go down. Like, this is, a crisis time, and people's lives are on the line. And so we made that message loud and clear, and we saw the media narrative change from the neighborhood versus the shelter to suddenly it was, oh, these two groups in the neighborhood, one wants them there, one doesn't, And then when we got together with Shams, we were able to even change that narrative further by making it's not the people in the neighborhood talking about the shelter residents, it's the shelter residents talking for themselves and saying, this is what we need. This is how you can help us. We're not here to disturb your community. We want to work with you. We're willing to work with you. We're here to bring people together. We're regular people, and we put Shams on those community board meetings, and you would see the difference in the tone when people realize, oh, homeless people have internet. Wait a minute, I can't just sit here and talk about them in these dehumanizing words, because they are here with me having this conversation. And the tone in the room would change from this sort of abstract, otherizing language to actually, it's human beings, and how do we create solutions? And I think one of the biggest markers of our success is that the first time the New York Times covered the controversy over the hotels on the Upper West Side, there wasn't a single shelter resident that was quoted. And the second time, after months of our advocacy work, they did a story. That story only contained quotes from shelter residents, and they didn't even give a quote to the other side that actually wants the shelters out.
Incredible, Corinne. I mean, thank you to you and to Shams and to this group of amazing individuals who have come together to make these positive voices louder. And it's clear that people are listening, people are paying attention, change is being made. And in the way that you talk about it, it actually doesn't take all that much to make those voices louder. And it just sounds crazy to think that anyone could just sort of accept the fact that this is happening without challenge. So this feels like a very important step. And Shams, I want to come back to the importance of advocating in the next question. And I do want to acknowledge that we're seeing a lot of amazing questions come through. So thank you. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. The time is going by so quickly. Shams, before we get to the advocacy component, Josh, I just want to come back to you as we are heading into winter and talking about the numbers of folks we're seeing who are experiencing homelessness. I'm thinking about the upcoming point in time count, which happens in the winter. And just to give everyone a little bit of context, in 2019, the national count posted that there are nearly 600,000 individuals experiencing homelessness across the US on any given night. Josh, could you tell us a little bit about what these numbers mean, how they get counted, how we all could get involved potentially, and some of the challenges that we face?
Yeah, absolutely. So once a year, the federal government will come out with a number of people who are homeless across the country. And the way that that's counted for people in shelters is a little bit more straightforward. It's the number of people who slept in the shelter that night. But for people on the streets, they actually need to be counted. So every city has its own version of something called a point in time count or a pit count. And in New York, once a year from midnight to 4 a.m., hundreds of volunteers throughout the city will walk virtually every block in the city and look for people who are homeless. And everyone you see, you ask a series of questions, basically determining if they have a place to stay that night. And that data is really, really important. It's not the most meticulous count. A lot of people are missed. In New York, for example, we're not supposed to count people who are in ATM vestibules. So I'll walk by someone who's sleeping in an ATM vestibule, but because that's counted as a private establishment, that person, we're not supposed to count them. And then also a lot of people I speak to who are homeless, especially in the winter, when they try to raise money throughout the day through panhandling or any other public solicitation of money, oftentimes they will use that money towards a hotel room. So maybe a group of 2 or 3 friends will once every 3 or 4 nights go stay in a hotel. So then those people won't be counted as well. So even though it's not a perfect count, it's really important that we do that. And I think this year, the number of people living on the streets is going to look very different than previous years. So the more volunteers across the country we get, the better. So if anyone wants to get involved with that, I would Google point in time count or pit count, and then your city or your town or wherever you are, and try to see if there's something going on there that you can get involved with. I've done it for the last couple years. It's certainly an interesting experience.
Thanks, Josh. That's really helpful. I want to ask Corinne one more question before we talk about the advocacy piece with Shams. I've witnessed a lot of people experience, what I think is something of a moral dilemma. They might pass an individual who is asking for spare change. I'm sure we've all experienced this. And while someone might be happy to offer a few dollars, they might refrain from doing so because they assume it's going to be spent on drugs and alcohol, and they're not wanting to contribute to that. Of course, offering money is a personal choice, but assuming that someone does want to contribute, how can we check our fear and judgment around offering this kind of help? Corinne, let's talk about coping mechanisms such as the use of drugs and alcohol and the relationship between unhoused folks and the use of substances. And also, why is it so hard to break this cycle?
Yeah. So, I mean, it just one thing in terms of offering money is, you always hear that phrase, like, don't, give a man a fish, instead teach a man to fish. And I like the redux on the phrase, which is like, if you give a man a fish, you can still teach him to fish, but he won't be starving while you try to do it. And I think that, if you give somebody money, their life is going to be a little bit easier. They might need more help than that, but their life is going to be a little bit easier in the meanwhile, right? If you give somebody that dollar, they're going to have that dollar to get the things that they need, in the meanwhile, while, other improvements are made. And I think, something that gets talked a lot about in homelessness is, this housing first model. And to explain that to people who don't know what that is, there used to be this idea that like you had to get people sober and you had to treat all of their, mental health challenges first. And then finally, once they were like had a job and they were perfect and stable and everything was great, then you could get them into housing. But I think that really gets the causality wrong. That's a word we use in economics a lot, like what causes what, because a lot of those challenges that they're facing might come from being in a housing insecure environment and the stress of that. And they might be therefore turning to substances to cope with that. And it might be exacerbating their mental illness problems. And so, what we found is that, in research is that people who get into housing first, a lot of times that decreases their need to be reliant on substances and, their mental health challenges. And so an example of that is that actually when this move from shelters to the hotels was happening, a lot of the service providers were very scared because they said in congregate shelters, we're using Narcan 20 times a month, which means we're stopping an overdose where someone's going to die, 20 times a month. And we can't do that in hotels because if someone's behind closed doors, how are we going to get to them? Well, since moving into the hotel shelters, what we found is that they've told us, one service provider in particular said, we used to use it 20 times a month. Since moving into the hotels, we've had one overdose. We've used it one time, because when people had that private space to go to where they could insulate themselves from the stress of having, 30 people who you don't know, where you feel physically unsafe, you feel threatened, you feel like you can't control your physical environment, and you're being exposed to other people's substance use, they were better able to self-regulate, and they didn't need to turn to substance use as much as a coping mechanism, and therefore we're experiencing fewer consequences from that. So, that's why we really focus on housing first as a potential way, to break that cycle, instead of thinking that you have to, and I think money first is another way to look at that too. It's like, if you give people resources, a lot of times that can improve their situation by itself.
Thanks, Corinne. It's really helpful when you break it down like that and just have this understanding that it's going to be very difficult to fix everything all at once, but we can take an opportunity to help make somebody's day just a little bit easier. So I think that's a really great thing to keep in mind. Shams, you have done so much work to give a voice to those who feel like they don't have one. You've been focusing so heavily on advocacy and clearly making some real progress. You're using your experience to pioneer change. How can we, the audience, how can we be better advocates?
Well, first of all, I would say that you listen to those that are directly impacted. You got to give the people that are going through the experience a voice in any discussion, a seat at any table. I think one of the problems is that, this is one of the benefits that Open Hearts have, is that they're open to really engaging people. They sit in our groups. They're there. They're facilitating groups like the AA meetings and the 12 steps. They're coming to the harm reduction, and they're able to, or the soulful walking talks with the faith leaders. So by them doing that, they're really able to understand exactly what we're dealing with, and they're also engaged with the service providers. So they're able to, just as people that are concerned, not necessarily advocates, but just as people that are concerned, that want to just help the situation, they're able to get a better understanding of it. I think at one point, when was a conflict, and Corinne could speak to this, there was a conflict between what was being presented to them from the service provider and the city, and then what was coming to them from the actual residents, So it took some time before they realized, wait a minute, these two are not meshing together. One is saying one thing and the other saying the other thing. And they came in the middle of that and said, you know what? Listen, if we're going to be involved in this situation, then you're going to have to hear what the residents are saying. And because they had the respect of the service providers, it was easier for me and other people like myself to be able to present ourselves and bring this argument forth. It shouldn't be like that, but and it probably won't be like that never again, because we changed that narrative. But I say to everybody that would like to join in this advocacy, one of the most important things is really to listen to those that are directly impacted. Those of us that are going through it, we can tell you all dynamics of it, and I don't discount, the professionals. I don't discount those that have expertise. It's very valuable to bring in people that have the clinical knowledge. It's very valuable to bring into those that have the political and the social and all these other dynamics. But we have to be at the same table so that we can put our collective information together to come up with the better ways to deal with this, to me, I consider it a man-made crisis, because it's something that really could be solved. It's just that it doesn't, the way we've been going with this, it doesn't really suit those who benefit from it to solve it. And so that's what we're really trying to change, and my thing is really, I'm just telling you as someone that's directly impacted. I have a history years ago of selling drugs. I have a history of actually going through state to state and creating empires, like drug empires. I changed that life, and I went out and I started bringing people out of that lifestyle, doing different things. So many years ago, but now here I am, in the shelter. And for the first time in my life, I'm face to face with people who were on the other side in the past, but we're in the same room now. These are people that are addicted to crack, addicted to dope and different drugs. And when I'm listening to them, I'm understanding that what the city has done, what the government has done, is they created environments that perpetuates drug abuse. They perpetuate mental illness. I suffer from mental illness. So at one point, it was okay to just engage in certain behavior patterns. And now that I'm trying to get some control over this and trying to maintain it and be normal in society, I'm understanding things for what they are. And I can honestly tell you that the way things are, it has to be totally dismantled. It has to be changed from the top down, because these systems, everything about it, from DHS to the mayor, as we can see in my particular case, which I think should be studied for the rest of the world, they don't give a damn about the voiceless, the vulnerable, and choiceless population that is the homeless community. And you see it all across the United States.
Thank you, Shams. There is so much that's wrong, and we have to acknowledge that. Corinne, I would love to get your perspective, I guess, like an economist perspective, why this is a question that came through. Why is it so inefficient? Is it just poorly run, or are politics at play?
I think that the answer that I want to give, I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think the answer that I think is most important is the one that Shams had brought up in our previous conversation, which is the legacy of systemic racism. And I think you really can't separate that from the conversation, because, there was a viral Facebook post a while ago of like, Finland has solved homelessness. Here's how they did it. And it's like, I know how they did it. They wanted to. We know what it takes, right? We know what people need. We know that if you offer people, real housing with the right services, that those people will come in off the streets, right? But we don't have the political will to do it, because the people who are most impacted by homelessness are Black and brown. And as a society, we tend to not vote for things that benefit the descendants of slaves disproportionately. And so as a society, we don't invest in things that, other countries enjoy, like public healthcare and, free high quality education for everyone. And I think homelessness is also part of that legacy. And so to me, it's not about that we don't know what the solutions are. We do. It's that we don't have the will to actually do it. And that was one of the things that I think, came out of this COVID crisis of people being moved into hotels in historically white neighborhoods, is that people then had to come face to face with the failings of our policy. And I hope that that will create the will to change them.
Thank you, Corinne. One of the other big questions that came through was just about how we can take grassroots initiatives similar to what's happening on the Upper West Side. How can we, within our own communities, even in a small way, start to take even the smallest steps? Like, what's something that we could all go out and do tomorrow, for example, that could make a difference? And that might seem like a broad question, but I think there are a number of things, and I would love to hear from each of you what your thoughts on that are. Shams, do you want to start? One thing that we could do tomorrow to have even a small impact?
Well, first of all, just talk to somebody that's experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
Whether they're on the streets, whether they're in a shelter, whatever the case, just talk to them and then find out, ask them. That's what the whole relationship that began with Open Hearts and Shams, the Homeless Hero, and Project Renewal, and the residents from the Lucerne. It all started with one simple question. When I said, look, the chalk is cute, well, we need more than that. It's cute, I like that. They said immediately, oh my God, thank you for reaching out to us. We was looking to talk to somebody who's in the shelter. What can we do to help you? That was the main question they asked me. They said, wait a minute, what are you doing right now? We can send somebody to meet you directly. And within 10 minutes, I was face to face with someone from Open Hearts, Amanda. And within 15 minutes of talking to Amanda, she committed to providing AA 12-step meetings free of charge, whether Project Renewal supported it or not. We would have did it in the park. Thank God Project Renewal supported it and we got it still going on. But within 15 minutes of asking us what we needed, they provided it free of charge. But the basis of that whole conversation, everything else we got going on, stemmed from one thing. They said, what do you need? They didn't wait for a list from Project Renewal. And at some point they got a list and I don't think they really pay attention to it. Because they talk directly with us and they're really catering to the residents, so much so that now Project Renewal is actually fulfilling the demands that are on that list that they got from the residents. You got to talk to the people that are directly impacted.
Thank you, Shams. Josh?
Yeah, I agree with Shams. I think if you're a person with privilege, you can use that privilege to bring other people's voices into the picture. I can give at least one example. There was a homeless gentleman who I worked with for a long time, who was experiencing some really awful trauma with police on the subways. And he had actually reached out to a number of people in the city council, to a number of elected officials, and tried to share what was going on with him. And his emails, his tweets all went unanswered. I did the same thing. They know me a little bit from the advocacy work, but I did the same thing. I said, I want to have a meeting about this. And I brought the individual with me to the meeting. I sat there and I didn't say very much beyond introducing myself. But sometimes what it takes is just to use your privilege to open that door for someone who, whoever on the other end is refusing to open it themselves. And I think there's just one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is just like, Shams, I didn't know you before any of this in the Lucerne, and like how did, as an advocate, like how did that happen that we didn't get to meet each other? And there's so many people like Shams in the shelter system whose voices are so powerful, but until they have that 15-minute talk with Amanda in the park, their voice might not be heard as much as it should. So we could all be Amanda in the park. We could all be someone like that, and trying to, if you have privilege, use it in a way to uplift someone else's voice who doesn't.
Thank you. Corinne?
I think where I would ask people to focus is on particularly male single adult shelters. And the reason I say that is because I have found that so many people who are opposed to the temporary hotel shelters in our neighborhood are like, oh, we would love it if it was a shelter for kids. And, I think that just shows all of our prejudices and all of our assumptions. It's like, Shams was once a kid. He was a child of the foster care system, and he got here because that system failed him. And so if you want to help a kid who's in the shelter system, then you should help Shams, who's before you right now, right? They are the same person. And so I think there's this assumption that because if it's out of sight, that other people are taking care of it. And I would say, get over that assumption that, everything is fine, and, go to find your nearest male single adult shelter and ask, what can the community do to support this shelter? What do you need? Do you guys need some Christmas gifts? Do you guys need a meal? And start there, because when you start to get to know people, and you can create those transformative relationships and, get to know everybody's stories, and it will change the prejudices that that people have when they kind of are looking at it in the abstract.
Thank you. Beautifully said. And I love ending on that note. Thank you, everyone. I know we're at time and we've hit upon a lot of big topics tonight. It's very clear that we need some serious systemic change in order to have wide scale impact. But it's so nice to talk about the ways that we can have small scale impact in the immediate term. And it's so important we get to this change through voices, powerful, positive voices who are willing to shift a mindset and shift perspective, challenging a way of thinking, get louder, get involved, form a coalition, and really raise the volume of these voices that have lived it and who are living it to make this informed change. We can't do it without those voices. And I hope that this conversation made you think and makes you feel empowered, encourages you to share something that you might have learned or something that you want somebody else to know. Tomorrow you'll receive an email with a link with some additional resources that we're going to continue to build upon if you want to learn more. And we really look forward to keeping this conversation going. To our amazing panelists, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your knowledge and experience. To our wonderful community that's here, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for your support. Shams, you want to add one more thing?
I'm sorry, I should have said it earlier, but I can't leave without saying this. About a week ago, we lost a resident. His name was Manny. He died here at the Lucerne. And I want to give a voice to him. You know, so many of us, sometimes we go through this experience and we are so invisible. Nobody's lifted his name up. So I got to take this moment to do that, if you don't mind. I do that because Manny was the first person that came to us. He was always a good guy. You know, he's a guy that, hey, you need something? You want some money? Here. You know, nah, man, I'm okay. But he came to me maybe a week, 2 weeks before he passed away, and he alerted me that there was somebody who was trying to offer money and gifts to some of the residents, you know, to join the lawsuit against us. Manny was the guy who first alerted us. And, you know, he was so concerned and, you know, he didn't take part in that. He was so concerned about the well-being of the other residents that he offered to do an affidavit for the lawyers and stuff and actually put this out for the public, you know, and you know, with the lawsuit. And a week later, Manny passed away here at the Lucerne. He's the death that you hear people talking about. You hear a lot of people on the other side make a mockery of. But I just wanted to give him some recognition and a voice and some presence because he was really a good guy, you know. And part of the reasons why I'm so committed to changing what we're dealing with now is because I don't want to see these type of deaths no more. I've seen a few of them. These are really good people. And I want to change the whole dynamic of the shelter system because I don't want to lose people. This is a 40-year-old brother that shouldn't be dead right now. There is something about this environment that is not conducive to the health and wellness of people. And I must end with this. I turned down an apartment. They offered that to me. I could be in my own place right now. I said, no, take it. I don't want it. I'm going to continue this fight. I did that because I'm not going to stop until we make the changes we need to make. I do it not just for myself. I could be all right now in that apartment. But I'm gonna stick with this, whether we stay here at the Lucerne or go to the Radisson. And I'm gonna keep doing what I've been doing and amplifying my voices and working with Open Hearts and Bombas and everybody that's committed to making these changes. But I want to say rest in peace to Manny and all of those brothers and sisters that we have lost in this experience. That's what I wanted to say. So.
Thank you. beautiful ending to remember Manny and for all of the hard work that's going into keeping people safe and housed. So I think we can end it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Corinne. Appreciate you being here. So many great questions in here. Okay, I think I'm going to close this out.